is completion of the environmental review record. For CDBG, this is one of the pre-contract activities, simply because if you can't get through the environmental review record process, the entire project is called into question. If you end up needing to do an environmental impact statement, we know that that will delay your project. So it's really important to begin with the end in mind. Thank you, Stephen Covey. And think about how you will approach completing your environmental review process before you come to us for funding. There are set sequences in place, set steps in place that Kelly's going to talk about. One of the big takeaways is this: if the environmental review record is not completed accurately or timely, it will derail your entire project. And that's why we're doing this training, because we know that after you've put in the effort to get a project submitted and reviewed and funded, we don't want anything to interfere with its ongoing success. So with that, I want to welcome you again. I'm going to toss it to Sherry to walk us through any kind of logistical issues. I expect you'll mention when we're taking a break, and then pass it on to Kelly. Thanks for being with us today. Sherry?
All right. So just as we said for the last couple of trainings, there's a lot of folks online. So we're going to ask everyone to mute. It's the button on the left-hand side on the bottom of their board. Speaking of muting, I needed to mute for a moment. My dogs were carrying on. So that's the mute. If you have your hand raised, it's the fourth button over on the bottom. And of course, you can always post your questions in chat. Kelly, do you want to throw up the agenda very quickly, just so we can kind of see your break schedule for this afternoon?
Sure. Just give me 1 second.
Absolutely. And I'm going to turn it over to Kelly.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and get the agenda up. Bear with me. Let's see. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Okay. Well, we had this wonderful welcome from Amanda Healy. I'm going to go over an introduction module and then go over a module on the environmental review record background. And then we'll take a break from 1:50 to 2:05, depending on how long it takes us. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Sherry, is this agenda on the website?
Yes, it was posted on the website yesterday. It's been shared, so it should be live on our training webpage.
Okay, I'll put the web link in the chat box, or Sherry, if you want to do that, so everybody can have the agenda if they want it at their fingertips. And I'm going to go over questions. So at the end of each module, I'm going to have a section for questions for the module that we've just done. And you can put them in the chat or you can unmute, but there will be a section at the end of each module for questions. So let me present. Can everybody see that? Wonderful. All right, so my name is Kelly Cherpich, and I'm a community development specialist here in our Abington field office. I've also been tasked with being the responsible CDS for the environmental review record and the environmental review process. And fellow introverts, please don't hate me, but we're going to do a little icebreaker. So I want you to think about what's your favorite backyard bird and put it in the chat, or you can unmute if you want to. My favorite bird, as you can see, is a rose-breasted grosbeak. He got very plump eating sunflower seeds in front of my house. So, all right, it looks like we've got some answers. We got a couple bluebirds. We got some cardinals. A crow. Somebody had a really good one with a crow. We've got some finches. Robert has a kingfisher that hangs out. some hummingbirds. So the reason, ooh, a hawk, an osprey. Do you have osprey in your backyard? That's really cool. But the reason we did this icebreaker is because we're doing the environmental review records training. So the biggest purview of why we do the environmental review record and the environmental review process is so we can protect the environment, which is where our little birdie friends live. So I hope you enjoy that. That's the last fun we're going to have for the rest of this presentation. That's it. No more fun. Oh, owls do count. Bald eagles do count. So let's see. All right. So I want to go ahead and ask everybody, all of our participants, how comfortable are you with the environmental review process? Are you level 1? You don't know what an environmental review is. You never even heard the term. Are you a number 2? You know a little, but you're still kind of new. Number 3, you're pretty comfortable, but you have some questions. Or number 4, you need to be presenting this. You're coming after my job. You want me to not be here anymore. All right. Got a lot of 3s. Got a lot of 3s. Couple 4s. Okay, Ellen, I see you. Coming after my job. That's okay. Got some 1s. All right. So I want to ask how comfortable you are with the environmental review process. First of all, to say that if you're a 1, I hope you're not confused. If you're a 4, I hope you're not bored. Second of all, to give you a little bit of a backstory, I've been learning about the environmental review process since probably about 2019 in depth, and I still have questions every single day. So this is a judgment-free zone. Do not feel like your questions are dumb or anything. Also, the first Nepa HUD training that I took was geared towards entitlement, so I was confused for this first 6 months as a CDS. So do not feel bad about yourself if you're level 1. And shoot, it's not advancing. 1 second. There we go. And what is your role in preparing the environmental review record? Are you from a locality, so you're a grantee, aka a responsible entity? So a town manager, county administrator, a chief elected official, so on. Are you a grant manager? So from a PDC, from a regional commission, or from a consultant, so you'll manage the project from start to finish. Are you a consultant? You're just here to do environmental reviews, or are you just here to learn and talk about backyard birds? All right, it looks like we have mostly 2s, a couple 3s and 4s. Okay, you're here because you received a grant. That's great. We'll go over COVID-19 environmental reviews. See a lot of number 2s in here, so that is great. Grant managers are really the most hands-on people that we have in preparing the environmental review record. The grant manager prepares it, but the responsible entity, aka the grantee, is the one that is responsible for whatever's in the environmental review. So a grant manager can prepare it, but the locality or grantee is the one ultimately responsible for all the information contained in your ERR. All right, and saying that, I'm going to go ahead and say this. So DHCD's role in the environmental review process. So what exactly do we do after you do your environmental review? So we provide technical assistance during the completion of your environmental review process, review the environmental review record for accuracy and completion, and we make sure that all regulatory agencies have been contacted and mitigation measures are complete if that is applicable to your project. We ensure proper publications and postings are complete, once again, if that's applicable to your project. And we ensure that the HUD Form 701515, aka the Request for Release of Funds and Certification, also known as the RROFC, is accurate, and we process that. So we do not complete the environmental review other than for projects where we assume the responsibility for responsible entity. It's not DHCD's purview to complete the environmental review process. So once again, The grantee is responsible for the environmental review record, but we are here to help you along the way and to make sure you do it right. Okay. So I want to go over a couple of caveats before we really get started. And don't be discouraged if some of the things in the previous slide did not make sense to you. We're going to go more in depth with those, I promise. But before we dive any further, I'd like to point out that the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, aka NEPA, which you're going to be hearing a lot of during this training, is a federal law that requires all projects that receive funding through any federal agency to review the impact the project will have on the environment. That being said, every federal agency does things a little differently. This training is geared towards projects that complete ERRs for Community Development Block Grant, CDBG projects, which are regulated by HUD. If you're preparing a non-CDBG environmental review record, NEPA will still apply if you're using federal funds, and hopefully the information in this presentation should be useful, but make sure you follow specific rules and regulations per your funding agency. So this is, like I said, HUD specific for CDBG projects. And also this training will be as in-depth as I can possibly make it, but not everything can be covered in 2 days. They literally have graduate courses on this, so I'm good, but I'm not that good. And if you have questions at the end of every module, we're going to have a space for questions. Like I said, if you have the question, somebody else probably has the question too. Do not be afraid to ask a question, and I will provide the answer as best as I can. And if I can't provide it right now, I'll get to you later and we'll figure it out. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to our next module, which is the background of the environmental review record. So if you give me 1 second, I'm going to switch PowerPoints. Okay. Can everybody see this? Awesome. All right. So let's get into a little bit of background on the environmental review process. The what's, the whys, the who's, the how's of the environmental review process. So first and foremost, what is an environmental review? And this seems pretty basic, but if you're level 1 or you're new, this might be useful to you. At its most basic level, an environmental review is essentially exactly what it sounds like. A project is reviewed before any actions are undertaken to determine its impact on the environment. So while that definition is a pretty good starting point, the official HUD definition gives us some additional clarity. HUD states that an environmental review is a process required under the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, aka NEPA, and all related acts to determine if any project expending federal funds will negatively affect the environment. And don't worry, we're going to discuss the NEPA and related acts further on. And let's go ahead and define what an environmental review is. The environmental review record is the documentation that is compiled from completing the environmental review process. The ERR has several important functions, and they are to provide the public and officials a way to judge environmental impacts before any dirt is turned and before any money is spent. It helps to tell the story of the project. It creates a paper trail of clear and concise documentation that shows due diligence should any problems arise in the future. And that brings us to our next point. So if it is not in writing, it didn't happen. Everybody here that's ever worked on a grant knows that phrase. And it is one of the most important concepts, not just for the environmental review process, but for grant management as a whole. Since a locality is on the hook for not only compliance with federal laws, but any environmental challenges or lawsuits that may arise, the environmental review record is a proof that all steps were properly completed by the grantee. So this is sometimes the phrases environmental review, so ER and environmental review record are used interchangeably. I want to go ahead and clear this up before we get any further. So the environmental review is the output. So that's the research, the consultation of regulatory agencies. So the environmental review is the process, whereas the environmental review record is the outcome. So that's the documentation from the entire process. So that is something that people get a little confused about, but hopefully that clears it up. Now, why do we do environmental reviews? Is it because I just like to review things? I want to see a lot of paper and documentation? Oops. No, it's not. It is because we complete an environmental review because we not only want to preserve the integrity of the environment, but we also want to protect the integrity of the project. So not only can a project harm the environment, but the environment has the potential to harm the project. We don't want to use federal funds, aka public dollars, to pay for a project that may not stay around. For example, when dealing with housing rehabilitation, we don't want to rehab a house and place it right back in a flood zone. We also do environmental reviews because it secures the value of public investment. It results in feasible and sustainable projects, helps avoid litigation. Grantees avoid monitoring and findings and sanctions from HUD. It avoids and mitigates environmental impacts that could harm our beneficiaries, our projects, the surrounding environment, and most importantly, we do it because it's the law. The National Environmental Protection Policy Act, NEPA of 1969, states, and here it is, the regulations. This is a charter document for environmental protection. This is directly from the regulations, and you're wondering why DHCD may be strict on the environmental review record. Like I said, it is because adherence to the environmental review for our projects is not my personal rule. It's not a DHCD rule or even a HUD rule, but rather a federal law. So it goes without saying that the environmental review process is something we want to make sure that we get right. Now, what exactly is the National Environmental? That's supposed to say policy instead of protection. So I apologize. So what exactly is the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969? So NEPA is the umbrella that encompasses all environmental factors. So think of it as the large umbrella for all federal agencies that give out grant funds. Underneath the umbrella are all federal agencies' interpretations of NEPA specific to their respective programs. These include HUD, who administers CDBG, and HOME and ARC, which is Appalachian Regional Commission grants. And HUD has its own subsection underneath the NEPA umbrella called the Related Acts that is required to be followed. These are the Related Acts from HUD, and they can be found in Appendix 2R, which provides HUD-specific guidance to 25 CFR Part 40, 24 CFR Part 58, that's supposed to say 24. The implementation of HUD, the environmental process, and all related acts can be found in the federal regs under 24 CFR Part 58. When you fill and complete a statutory checklist during the environmental review process, the checklist is there to ensure compliance with all of these related acts. Appendix 2A, pages 5 through 33, in our grant management manual has a statutory checklist and the worksheet to complete all of this related information. Also, Appendix 2R provides specific HUD guidance to these related acts. The HUD Exchange is also a valuable resource. It has a section on each one of these acts, which we'll go on to further in the training. But we'll get more in depth with when we do the completion of the statutory checklist. And if you notice, Part 58.6, which is on the right side, airport hazards, runway clear zones, and accidental potential zones, flood disaster protection, and coastal barrier resource act. Those are under 58.6, and every single project, whether it's exempt or it's an environmental impact statement level of determination, they all have to follow those. So, touched on this earlier, who exactly is responsible for the information in the ERR? The responsible entity. Under 24 CFR Part 58, HUD states that counties, cities, and tribes can assume HUD's environmental responsibilities. The responsible entity is a unit of local generalized government who would be the grantee with DHCD. CDBG funds can only go to UGLUGs, So Unit of Generalized Local Government, UGLUGS, it's a fun acronym. I love to say it all the time. And those are the responsible entities for our CDBG projects for the environmental review. In the case of nonprofits that are grantees, that's usually only with Appalachian Regional Commission projects, but Dhcd can and will assume the role of the responsible entity if the local government is unwilling to do so. The responsible entity is the entity that certifies and maintains ownership of the environmental review record. Well, most of our grantees, as we saw, work with a consulting agency, a PDC, or a regional commission. The responsible entity is the one that would be culpable for any inaccuracies contained therein. And hopefully this is never the case. But if any lawsuits were to arise, the responsible entity would be the ones that had to go to court. Like I said, I hope this never happens, but just letting you know. And this brings us to who acts as a certifying officer for the responsible entity. So the responsible entity's chief elected official is a certifying officer, and that's the highest ranking elected official. So for a town, it would be the mayor or chair of board of supervisors for a county, but it can be delegated to other government officials that have more hands-on approach to the project, such as a town manager or a county administrator, but it must be in writing. And there's a designation form available on our website or from your CDS. The certifying officer must have the technical capacity and administrative capability to carry out the environmental review duties, has the legal capacity to carry out environmental review responsibilities, holds the responsibility to act on the behalf of the responsible entity. So if you're the certifying officer, you're the one going to federal court. They execute the request for release of funds and certification. And if the chief elected official of a locality does not sign the environmental review record, a designation must be formally adopted. That is something new that I want to stress. It's not new, but we're enforcing it a lot more. So if you are not the mayor signing your environmental review record or chair of the board of supervisors, you need to get your designation in writing. And if you need a copy of that form, feel free to reach out to your CDS or to me, and we will get you a copy of that form. And this is what that looks like. So it's not a large undertaking. You can complete this when you do the rest of your pre-contract documents and you adopt those in front of your board meetings. And don't hate me, but at the end of every module, we're going to have a little, I think they used to call them pop quizzes, but I don't want to upset anybody with bad memories of pop quizzes. So we're going to do a little knowledge check. So I'm going to put these questions up here and we will go through them. If you want to put them in the chat, you can, or write them down, or think them to yourself, but we'll start with number 1. So what does ER and ERR stand for? So ER stands for environmental review, and ERR stands for environmental review record. What is the federal law that requires all projects funded with federal dollars to complete an environmental review? Bonus points if you have acronym, definition, and year. That is the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, also known as NEPA. What's the responsible entity, also known as the RE, for the ERR? That is the unit of generalized local government, so the town or the county, specifically for CDBG projects. And what does a certifying officer do? The certifying officer signs the environmental review record and is the chief elected official unless otherwise designated. All right, so that pop quiz wasn't too bad, or as Andrea Gaisley said, quizzy poos, so we can call them that if we want to. Does anyone have any questions from this first module? Okay, I'll give a couple of seconds while I get the other presentation up. Just put it in the chat if you do have any questions. Our break was scheduled from 1:50 to 2:05, but we went through a lot quicker than I thought we were going to. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next module, which is getting started, unless anybody really wants a break right now. And it doesn't seem like anybody does. All right. Let me pull up the next one.
Hey, Kelly, what does UGLG stand for?
Unit of Generalized Local Government, or UGLOG.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for throwing me a softball question, Amanda. I really appreciate it.
I think it was Vaughn Poller.
Oh, well, thank you. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our first steps of the environmental review project, which would be defining a project, the project map, and project aggregation. So the first step seems like a simple step, seems like a normal step, but it is a project description. This may seem like an obvious thing, but the first step, and arguably the most important step, is to define and describe your project. The project description is the groundwork for your entire environmental review record. Your project description is what is used to determine the level of review of the next steps of the environmental review, and it is used to complete the rest of the steps. Therefore, it needs to be concise and thorough, and it must include all the information presented on this slide, which is project name, type of construction, specific location, types of activities, and time frame. We also need to remember that if a project activity is not identified in the project description of the environmental review record, you cannot use grant funds to pay for it because we did not review it to see if it will impact the environment, so we can't pay for it. So obviously we need to include the project name, and if this is a multi-phase project, we need to know what phase of the project it is. We'll also need to define what type of project it is. Is it a housing project, infrastructure, downtown facades? The total cost of the project is good to put in here as well. I know sometimes when the environmental review record is started, you may not know which funding a project will be approved for, the exact dollar amount, but an approximation is always a good idea to include as well, although it is not necessary. Now, the location of the project may seem like a given, but we run into the issue of a location being too broad in this portion of the project description, which we're going to see on the next slides when we do a little bit of an example with our favorite fictional town of Possumville. So if you have been in trainings with me before, you know that's my favorite fictional town. All right, so this is an incorrect version of a project description. So the project name is the Possumville Water Project. The responsible entity is the town of Possumville, which is correct. We've got the Dhcd project number in here. We have who the preparer is, which is Kelly Cherpich with Grant Management Consultants, LLC. And then the certifying officer name and title. So luckily the mayor, who is Gretchen Opossum, is the one signing this environmental review record. So we do not need to do a designation form. And then the consultant, which would be Kelly Cherpich again, and you would direct comments to Kelly Cherpich. But I want you to really notice the project location. So the project location only says town of Possumville. Doesn't say where in the town of Possumville. Is it a townwide project? I don't know. I picked it up and I don't know. And the description of the proposed project says installation of water lines. That's it. That's all we know that's going on with the project. So clearly, this is not enough information to go on. So let's go to a correct view of the project description. So Gretchen Opossum, she's a very paws-on mayor. She decided to fire Kelly Cherpich, who was a terrible grant consultant, and she hired a new one, and this is a much better project description. So the project name is now the Duck Hollow Water Project, and that kind of clues us into where it's going to take place in the town of Possumville. The project location, as you can see, is much more descriptive. The Duck Hollow area of Possumville is bordered by Dauber Street to the north, Ellie Street to the west, Graham Street to the east, and Sheldon Street to the south, located within the town's limits. So ostensibly, if I walked off the street, which a member of the public can do and has the right to request to look at the environmental review record, I could feasibly find where this project is going to be located at. So the project description is much more detailed. The Duck Hollow water area of Possumville has been identified as having inadequate, reliable potable water access. Currently, residents rely on natural springs for water provision as no public water access is available. The $2 million Duck Hollow water project will oversee the new construction of public water lines in the project area. Project activities include design and installation of approximately 1,000 linear feet of 6-inch water line, design and installation of approximately 2,000 linear feet of 4-inch water line, installation of 3 fire hydrants, and design and installation of all related appurtenances. A total of 28 houses, 76 people will be connected to public water, with 20 of those households being low and moderate income, also known as LMI, for a total of 55 LMI individuals. CDBG funds will account for $1 million of the total project cost, while local funding will cover the remaining shortfall. Project construction is anticipated to be completed within 18 months of contract date, which would be summer 2027. So if you noticed, I have included everything that we needed to include in here, which is the type of construction, its new installation of water lines, the specific location, the types of activities. We're installing water lines, we're installing fire hydrants, we're installing all related appurtenances, and we're connecting people to public water. I've talked about how much it's going to cost. I've talked about the beneficiaries. I've talked about how long it's going to take us to do this. So I don't want to toot anybody's horn, but the new grant manager, John Doe, did a very, very good job with this. So let's move on to mapping your project. And I want to level with you all. I'm getting older and I cannot see as well as I used to. I have to use reading glasses in conjunction with my regular glasses. So please, that being said, make your maps big enough so that I can see what is going on. I cannot stress to you how happy a good map makes me, a phrase that I never thought I'd say it, but here we are. Your map should be detailed enough to show the project area and boundaries, and the key or legend should be visible and detailed enough so we can see what we're looking at. When reviewing an environmental review record for a housing project, usually I've seen grantees use one color for investor-owned rehab, another one for owner-occupied rehab, one for substantial, one for non-participating households, etc. That is perfectly fine and very much encouraged, but make sure that the color code is able to be seen. And also you don't print it in black and white and scan it in, because that's happened before and that does not help anybody at all. Additionally, you'll be using maps to show compliance with all your related laws and acts. One of the related acts underneath 24 CFR 58.6, once again, which applies to all CDBG projects, is the airport hazard section. So a map can be used to show that there is no airport to be found anywhere close to the project area. Make sure to include flood zone maps, even if you are not in a flood zone, to show that you're not in a flood zone. Nepa Assist is a very helpful tool, and it's very helpful at mapping. You can just go to Nepa Assist, type it into Google, and you can pull up any kind of mapping that you want to do for your environmental review record. And we'll talk about that in depth later. So what needs to be included in your environmental review record? So you're going to start compiling your environmental review record and working through the environmental process. And you want to know everything we're going to include so that you have a roadmap onto what to work on. An environmental review record must contain all of the following things on this slide. We've covered the project description and the maps, and we'll get into the statutory checklist, the environmental checklist, public notices, and documentation when we get into how to actually complete an environmental review. But, and this is a very important caveat that I want to tell everybody about, the environmental review record must be available for public review, whether that's at the town hall, the municipal building, or the county administration building. So if somebody walks off the street and says, I would like to do some light beach reading of your environmental review record, all 450 pages, please give it to me. Somebody needs to be there to print it out and give somebody a copy. I don't think that happens very often, but we have to have staff there to ensure if it does happen, somebody will be there to provide it. Also, in the digital age, it is permissible for the environmental review record to be located on the locality's website, but again, it must be made available hard copy if somebody requests it. And when I say it needs to be accessible for public review, it also needs to be at a level where anybody off the street could read it and understand what's going on. So don't put jargon in for jargon's sake. Don't be needlessly confusing. When you're writing out your determinations, say where a document is and where it can be found and what the document is. So it needs to be accessible not only physically, but so that anybody could read it and know what's going on in the community and how the project may be impacting the environment. So let's move on to project aggregation. And this is a little tricky concept to understand for some people. But under 24 CFR Part 58, subsection 32, a responsible entity must group together all activities underneath the purview of a completed project. What that means is that all activities must be included in the environmental review record as one cohesive project. So why do we aggregate? Aggregation promotes consideration of impacts such as a set of similar, connected, and closely related independent activities at one time. So instead of doing an environmental review piecemeal for projects, so if we have a comprehensive community development project, for example, and we're doing housing rehab, we're doing installation of water lines, we're doing installation of sewer lines, you don't do an environmental review for housing rehab and then do one for water lines and then do one for sewer lines. It's all one cohesive project, so do one cohesive environmental review. You also want to aggregate geographically as well. So if there's going to be a lot of projects in the future in one specific area, go ahead and do your environmental review for that whole area. And it helps tell the story of the overall project rather than by activity. So that allows consideration of if there are issues for mitigation and the cost of all activities together. So another example, once again, town of Possumville. Possumville, they had such a great project with the Duck Hollow water line installation. They're going to develop a site at their industrial park to support a crochet hook factory. That is the overall project. But Possumville will not do an environmental review record for each activity. So they're not going to do one for the grading, a separate one for paving, a separate one for stormwater, drainage, etc., so forth. They're going to do one for the entirety Possumville site development project at Henry Goose Industrial Park. So I said all that to say this: HUD requires that projects be aggregated. If you think that you're going to be applying for more money in another phase, go ahead and aggregate your project. And remember, your environmental review record is good for 5 years unless the project scope changes significantly, and then you can do a reassessment. All right, another pop quiz, or quizzy poo, as Andrea says, or whatever you want to call it. So what is the first step of the environmental review process? Oops. Okay, you got that one for free. It's a project description. Okay, the next one, true or false. If an activity is not identified within the project description of the environmental review record, Dhcd will not pay for it. All right, it looks like we have good answers. That is true. We will not pay for it if you do not identify it in the project description. And can an ERR be available for public review on the locality's website? Yes, it can, but you do have to print it out if somebody asks for it. And true or false, project aggregation is only necessary on large multi-year projects. A little bit of a tricky one. False. It's required to group together and evaluate as a single project all individual activities that are related. Okay. Do we have any questions from this module?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
And I bet you're going to get to this later, Kelly.
Yes, ma'am.
So one of the things that we know is happening is that from conception to installation, or from conception to bidding, project prices are increasing. So let's say we thought $1 million project is in fact going to be a $2 million project. Does that need to be reflected in the environmental review?
So the great thing about the environmental review is that it's a living document. However, I will say for project description, and when you put the project description in the request of release of funds and certification, you want to use the number that you have at that given time. You would not go back and change the request of release of funds and certification. But you could go back and add in a note to the project description to say, due to increased prices, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, prices have increased to $2 million. That's not something that is HUD required that we have to add in the project price and the project description, but we do have to add it into the request of release of funds and certification. So it's good practice to go ahead and do it when you do your project description.
Thank you. Next question. So we also know that for a variety of reasons, and thank goodness not in most cases, but you know, we do occasionally have projects that take longer than their allotted 2-year initial contract period. You said that the environmental review is good for 5 years. So is that from the conclusion of the environmental review process? Does that clock start when we issue a contract? Talk a little bit about that, please. And,
Okay.
and let's say we have a project that takes 6 years and it's at 5.5 years that the last element is bid. What happens in that case related to the environmental review?
That is a great question. I should not have been so excited for the softball question earlier. So the environmental review record is not considered complete for CDBG projects until your DHCD community development specialist gets your request of release of funds and certification and okays on it. So that is when your environmental review record is complete. You may have started the process of the environmental review a year earlier, but you do not finish it until you get your request of release of funds and you publish all your notifications. So that is when the clock starts ticking for the 5 years. And unfortunately, with the project that takes 5.5 years, after 5 years, you will need to do a reassessment of the project. Luckily, if nothing has changed in those 5 years, it's a very simple form that you can fill out. It says, hey, nothing's changed, nothing has presented itself, and your environmental review record is still good. However, if something may have changed, if something has come up during that time, you might have to stop and redo the whole environmental review record. I don't anticipate that happening with most of our projects, but it is something that could always happen.
Thanks, Kelly. Those are all my questions for now.
No problem.
Kelly, I just want a clarification question about project description and project area. If your project area changes and the scope changes in that project, will you need to republish that environmental review record?
Okay, so if the project changes by more than 20%, either increase or decrease, or if the project area changes, you will need to. Wait 1 second. Let me ask this question. When you say the project area changes, are we adding something in that was captured in the first environmental review?
We're adding something in that's captured in the initial environmental review.
All right. You would not have to republish your FONSI or anything, or your request of release of funds, so you're still good. But for DHCD rules, you would have to redo another public hearing to say that the project area will be changed, but the environmental review captured it in the initial part.
Perfect. Thank you, Kelly.
Okay. Is there an environmental review record related to a CDBG project that has been determined by DHCD to meet or exceed the standards described that can be shared? I have good ones that I've had that I've used before to show people, but I would have to go in and heavily, well, I wouldn't actually have to heavily redact it. That is public information. So I will work on getting a good one to share out with everybody. And maybe at the end of the training, we can share that out for everybody. And it'll be an environmental assessment level of environmental review record, because that'll be like the highest one you would complete. No problem. Are there any other questions? All right, let's move on to determining level of review. So give me 1 second. Oh, actually, it's 1:50. Do we want to go ahead and take a break? That's when we had it scheduled initially. We want to go ahead and take a break.
Yep.
We want to meet back here at 2:05. Would that work?
Yep.
All righty.